The battles of the medieval era were often some of the most spectacular in human history, as they involved unique tactics, some of which are still used today. So saddle up as we take you through the top 15 incredible medieval military tactics. Number 15. Siege tactics. The medieval period saw a massive rise in the number of castles dotting the hills of Europe, and as you might expect, these heavily guarded fortresses could often only be penetrated with the help of a siege. This involved completely blocking the entrances and exits of an enemy's castle for weeks, months, or years at a time, with this being done until the castle ran out of resources and had no choice but to submit to an attacking army. In order to hold up against attacks, many cities would also have massive defensive walls, which would in turn make besieging a city a very common practice. Therefore, while playing the long game may have been annoying to some, siege tactics were often the best way to starve out and ultimately win against an enemy. Number 14. Single envelopment. Enemies' armies tend to have weak spots, and if you can spot them and deploy troops to exploit them, then you can often achieve victory in a battle that would have otherwise been hard to win. One of the easiest ways to exploit a weak spot is by using a single envelopment. This involves using some of your units to flank the enemy on one side, with the hope being that you can find somewhere easy to breach and wreak havoc. Once this breach is found, the side that is attacking the flank would then have to envelop the flanks closer to the center, with the idea being that as each enemy division is defeated, your now freed divisions would help the single envelopment become stronger until it overwhelmed the enemy. Now, it should be remembered that this required a lot of patience, as if a single envelopment occurred too soon, it could easily cause a breach in your own lines. However, when pulled off correctly, single envelopment could be a one-stop shop to victory on the battlefield. Number 13. Cannons and guns. While most people associate the Middle Ages with knights, swords, lances, and bows and arrows, it turns out that by the end of the medieval period, cannons and guns were being commonly used. In fact, by 1326, the oldest known picture of a gun was created, and by 1350, Petrarch wrote that the presence of cannons on the battlefield was as common and familiar as other kinds of arms. Beyond the battlefield, cannons were also making their way onto ships, and artillery was fast becoming extremely important for long-range attacks throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. It was this increase in gun usage that allowed medieval armies to dramatically shift their strategies and transition into the early modern era of warfare. Number 12. Defense in depth. While large defensive walls are rather impressive, they aren't exactly the most effective way to stop an enemy. After all, if just one area is breached, you may leave large swaths of land completely exposed. For millennia, there existed a defensive tactic that does the exact opposite, known as defense in depth. It's the practice of having multiple smaller areas of defense that can both tire out the enemy over a long period of time and make the enemy's attack a logistical nightmare. This usually is pulled off by having several forests and castles rather than one large wall of defense, as the enemy would have to exert more effort on attacks to several smaller targets than they would have to on one large one. Once this has occurred, the idea would then be to cause the enemy to retreat with a series of defensive counterattacks. And while this strategy dates back all the way to antiquity, it first really came into widespread use during the Middle Ages, when European hill forts and the development of concentric castles created fortified barriers across vast areas of land. So we think it's fair to say that at the time, invading all of Europe would have been a very difficult task. Number 11. Relics. Most people would agree that good luck symbols shouldn't be relied upon to save you on the battlefield. But during the Middle Ages, they were considered to be an essential item in any military attack. That's because they were seen as an important source of supernatural power that served both as a spiritual weapon and a form of defense. And the strength of these relics was believed to be so acute that they were often seen as more important than walls, weapons, and warriors. Generally speaking, these relics would have some sort of religious significance, and at least in Christian countries, relics would often be the old belongings and body parts of martyrs or saints. So while they likely didn't do a whole lot in reality, the usage of them in battle certainly served as a morale boost for the troops. Number 10. Night attacks. While most of history's most well-remembered battles occurred during the day, occasionally medieval tacticians would attack at night. The idea here was to cause as much chaos and confusion as possible, with this being possible due to the lack of preparation on the part of the sleeping soldiers and the cover of darkness. But oftentimes these attacks were quite risky. Nevertheless, one of the most famous night attacks occurred on June 17th of 1462. That's because when at war against the Turks, Wallachian Prince Vlad the Impaler decided to take advantage of the Turkish Sultan's poor decision to allow his soldiers from leaving their tents at night. According to contemporary accounts, Vlad and some of his soldiers first entered the camp disguised as Turks to attempt to kill the Turkish Sultan and find out more about the enemy. While they failed in their first goal, they succeeded in the second, and this gave the Wallachians enough info to absolutely hammer the Turks while they were in their camp. So, while attacking at night may be risky, the reward for doing so can be great. Number 9. The Chiltron. While Scotland may not be the first nation that comes to mind when you think of great military powers, during the medieval period they perfected a military tactic that was absolutely devastating. Known as the Chiltron, it was essentially a formation for pikemen, where they would form a two-layered shield wall, with the front regiment acting as the shield and the back ones sticking their 3 to 4 meter long pikes above the wall. Used extensively by the Scots against the English during the Scottish Wars of Independence in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, they generally came in either a circular or rectangular shape. Circular Chiltrons would usually be static and defensive, as rather than charge they would wait for the enemy to try to break their shield and overcome their pikes, which, as you might have guessed, typically proved deadly for the English. However, the rectangular form of the phalanx could also be offensive in nature, as when the shield wall was equipped with axes, it would be extremely difficult for the English to crack the Chiltron open. Therefore, while this formation could not work with today's weaponry, it was lethal during the medieval era. We are constantly adding more people to the Top 5's production team to bring you all the best content. Be sure to subscribe with notifications on and hit the like button. Number 8. The Flying Wedge. Shield wall tactics like the Chiltron were certainly hard to beat, but one of the few assaults that it was very vulnerable to was the Flying Wedge. In essence, the Flying Wedge is a triangle-shaped formation where the attackers concentrate a lot of their efforts on the point, with the idea being that this can cause the central point of the defender's forces to collapse and then allow attacking forces to wreak havoc. While it was first used in ancient times, it became very popular in the Middle Ages. The reason for this was because by putting very highly skilled soldiers at the point, defense tactics such as Chiltrons could be breached, thus allowing the attackers from behind the breach to swoop into this breach and overwhelm the defending force. As a result of its effectiveness, flying wedges are still used today and have even found their way into the tactics of riot squads who want to both protect themselves and do away with rowdy rioters. So while this tactic may be old, it certainly remains relevant today. Number 7. The Crescent Formation. Sometimes an enemy force can be just too great of a match for the center of your forces, but if you adapt quickly, you can easily envelop them into a deadly encirclement by using a crescent formation. In essence, this occurs when you begin to stretch at your flanks as your enemies attack you, eventually encircling them into a deadly hold. While there are several examples of this formation in play, one of the most famous came during the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. Fought between the Seljuk Empire and the Byzantines, the Seljuks began the battle by putting a lot of soldiers on the flanks and making the middle of their forces farther back and less numerous. This caused the Byzantines to take an early lead as they began pressing the center of the line and started pushing it backward. However, it was at this point that the Seljuks' left flank began to attack the Byzantine center forces, and the Seljuk center forces began to attack the Byzantine's right flank, essentially enveloping both forces into two crescent-shaped envelopes and crushing them. So while it certainly requires a lot of communication to pull off, if executed correctly, it can lead to the annihilation of the enemy's strongest units. Number 6. The Oblique Order. Generally speaking, most battle formations have soldiers fight in relatively even formations, but commanders using the Oblique Order do things a little differently. That's because rather than spread forces along a formation, a large number will be concentrated on just one flank, with the idea being that they will overpower the enemy's weaker flank, while the rest of your troops simply hold the rest of the line in a defensive manner. This tactic is great when you're going against a numerically superior force, as while those holding the line will have a tough time, the oblique flank allows you to have a much greater number of soldiers in one part of the battlefield, making victory much easier. Now, one of the best executions of the Oblique Order occurred in the Middle Ages during the Battle of Yarmouk. Fought between the Byzantine Empire and the Rashidun Caliphate in August of 636, the Rashiduns began the battle by amassing all of their cavalry behind the right flank, while having their center and left flank forces simply tie down the enemy in a defensive way. This allowed the Rashidans to perform a massive cavalry and infantry attack on the Byzantines' left flank, completely annihilating it as it began to envelop the Byzantine center. This caused the Byzantines to flee, leading to a decisive victory for the Rashidans. Number 5. Double envelopment. Flanking an enemy can often be a very successful maneuver, as it involves moving troops to the side of the enemy's formation so that you can force an enemy to fight on two sides of the battlefield at once. However, flanking on one side of the battlefield often isn't enough, and instead many military commanders of the medieval period opted to perform a double envelopment. In essence, this is when an army flanks both sides of the enemy's forces at the same time in almost pincer-like motion in order to entrap them. One famous medieval example of this tactic occurred at the Battle of Wallajah in modern-day Iraq in the year 633. Fought between the Rashidun Caliphate and the Sasanian Empire, the Rashidans were able to successfully defeat the numerically superior Sasanians by using a variation of the double envelopment tactical maneuver. The Rashidans first began by fighting the Sasanians head-to-head, with the Rashidans taking a rather defensive position in order to sustain as few casualties as possible. However, what the Sasanians did not realize was that there were two cavalry divisions behind their lines, and thus when the Rashidans approached them from behind to attack the left and right flanks of the Sasanians were encircled. As a result, while the Rashidans ended up losing just 2,000 soldiers out of the 15,000 they had fielded, the Sasanians lost 20,000 of the 25,000 they had led into battle, making it a massive military defeat. So we think it's fair to say that while larger numbers can often make winning a battle much easier, if a commander does not scout along their flanks and collect good intelligence on their enemy, then they can be decimated in a matter of hours. Number 4. Feigned retreat. At the surface, the feigned retreat is a very simple maneuver. It's a type of feint where soldiers will retreat on purpose, with the hopes of being that this will lure the enemy troops into a position where they're even more vulnerable. While this may sound easy, the reality is that it requires very skilled troops, as if the troops become unorganized and don't properly lure the enemy to the trap position, then the retreat becomes very real. Feigned retreats have been used on the battlefield since ancient times, but one of the most successful uses of it during the medieval period occurred at the Battle of Lechfeld. Fought between the Principality of Hungary and the Principalities of East Francia and Swabia in the year 910, the Hungarians were able to win the battle by using a series of feigned retreats. More specifically, rather than engage with the entirety of the Frankian and Swabian armies, the Hungarian light cavalry continually retreated, and this caused the enemy's heavy cavalry to pursue them. Rather than completely outpace them, the Hungarians allowed the Frankians and Swabians to remain very close behind. And since the Hungarians would attack where they saw weaknesses and retreat when they had heavy losses, their enemy kept pursuing them as they believed they are truly retreating. However, after about 12 hours of fighting and riding, the Hungarians had finally lured them into a forest that had concealed the Hungarian reserves. And it was at this point that the Hungarians descended upon the tired Frankians and Swabians, inflicting heavy casualties and ultimately winning the battle against them. So while feigned retreats may look like the real deal, in reality they can be the ultimate military trap. Number 3. The hit and run. While hit-and-run tactics were used all the way back in the times of the Romans, it was a solid strategy for armies that were trying to tire out their opponents during the Middle Ages. More specifically, it involves using a series of short surprise attacks, with the idea being that your army would retreat before the enemy army can respond in force. While this involves constant maneuvering and very good planning, it allows you to never fully engage with the enemy, and while it will almost never lead to decisive victories, it allows you to weaken your enemy's forces and lower morale. As a result, this is a preferred tactic by rebel groups during the modern era, but in medieval times its most famous use was during the Battle of Ain-Jalut, fought between the Mamluk Sultanate and the Mongol Empire in 1260. The Mamluks were able to defeat the superior force of Mongols by consistently using a series of hit and runs, which provoked the Mongol troops while preserving the bulk of the Mamluk forces. So when the Mamluks then began a feigned retreat, the Mongols fell for the bait due to them believing that the Mamluk force was actually as small as it was during the hit and runs. This led to the Mongols being lured into an area filled with Mamluks, causing the Mongols to be encircled on all sides. As a result, the majority of the Mongols perished, marking a great victory for the Mamluk Sultanate. So while this tactic may make the enemy army believe that your forces are quite weak, it can have some serious psychological effects that can ultimately allow you to trick them into submission. Number 2. Scorched Earth. Scorched Earth tactics are a classic method in making an enemy's advance as miserable as possible. That's because it's essentially a practice where a retreating army will destroy anything that could be of use to the enemy, with this including the burning of buildings, food supplies, valuables, weapons, communication sites, vehicles, and believe it or not, even the local people themselves. In today's day and age, using Scorched Earth tactics to their fullest extent is against international law. After all, the 1977 Geneva Conventions made it illegal to target civilians, but nonetheless, Scorched Earth tactics are still used in modern warfare. We think it's fair to say that some of the most prominent examples occurred during the medieval period. One major occurrence was the Harrying of the North, initiated by William the Conqueror in order to stop a northern English rebellion in 1069. The subjugation was so brutal that William's men burnt down whole villages, slaughtered their inhabitants, and destroyed all livestock and agriculture, with this being done so that the remaining survivors would have to resort to cannibalism. While this certainly worked in the short term, as the area was in too desperate of a state to rebel, the 100 to 150,000 that had to pay the price was absolutely ghastly. However, at times, Scorched Earth tactics were more psychological than utilitarian. Such was the case in 1462, when a large Ottoman army led by Sultan Mehmed II marched into Wallachia. The infamous Vlad the Impaler was the ruler of this area, and rather than simply retreat, he conducted Scorched Earth tactics that were so brutal that he left about 20,000 impaled heads outside the city of Targovist. Apparently, the Sultan was so repulsed by this forest of dead and dying bodies that he withdrew from the battle altogether and instead sent Vlad's brother Radu to lead the Ottomans on his behalf. Number 1. Deception. Sometimes the best military tactics are the most underhanded ones, and when victories aren't forthcoming, the only option that is often left to engage in is deception. This is the act of misleading an enemy by using rather sneaky means, and it's one of the oldest tricks in the book. And while we can point at examples of deception occurring across human history, some of the tricks used during the Middle Ages were especially sneaky. Perhaps the most famous medieval force in the realm of deception were the Mongols, a nomadic tribe of people hailing from Central Asia. They were able to conquer virtually all of the Asian steppe and significant portions of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East by using deception tactics to make their forces appear much larger than they were. More specifically, they would engage in practices such as lighting multiple campfires per person, having prisoners and civilians ride horses and raise up dust behind enemy lines to make it seem like there was an incoming army, and mounting dummies onto horses. If they wanted enemy armies to underestimate them, they would also use deception, with their tactics including riding in a single file line to minimize dust and engaging in feigned retreats. Beyond the Mongols, many other groups also engaged in deception. Foremost among them was the Tudor family in England, who in 1401 captured Henry Percy's county castle by having a Tudor impersonate a carpenter, walk inside, then let his allies in. Since this was partially responsible for the Tudors becoming the royal family of England for the next 118 years, we'd say that this deception was pretty successful. So while we don't recommend deceiving your friends, family, and neighbors, if you ever happen to be leading troops on the field of battle, then deception may be the way to go. Watch our binge-watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and get ready to binge.